All right, welcome back. We are going to talk about more data points from the study guide, just kind of continuing to review here. So we talked about the Romantic period. We talked about the Enlightenment period. And for Enlightenment, think 1600s. For Romantic period, think the first half of the 1800s. Let's see. What else do we want to talk about? Let's see. Okay, let's talk about some of the Romantic musicians because they are quite important. So let's see, Romantic art and music is what we want to look at here. So we looked at Romantic art. Some of the major Romantic era musicians were people like Beethoven. In the Romantic period, their music had developed to quite a degree of detail. And you had really sort of genius composers like Beethoven coming along. I played for you his Third Symphony, Fifth Symphony, and Ninth Symphony. But in general, this is the time period of big orchestras. So it's in some ways similar to the music that we saw during the Enlightenment period, music that's also known as classical or Baroque, but just more instruments, bigger orchestras. There's also an interest in sort of developing new forms of music. So you have program music, music that it tells a story. You have the works of Chopin. Chopin was basically all about piano music, and he sort of perfected the etude, which is, a piano piece that's designed to test your skill. We saw that short piece where the pianist was just flying over the keys there. That's the kind of thing we get from Chopin. We also have people like Schubert, or really I should say, no, it is Schubert in German. Schubert, who is setting poems to music. And that form of song where you set poems to music is the Lied. So these are some of the things that are going on in Romantic music during this time period. This is also the time period where we see ballet and opera being very popular. One of the most famous being Wagner, who created that whole series of operas based on the ring cycle from Norse mythology. And so this is kind of tied into his nationalist ideas because he was very much obsessed with German ethnic identity and somewhat of a racist, to be honest. But he did create some good music around the idea of this Norse German culture. All right. Let's see. Going back, sorry, I have to keep jumping back and forth. Going back to the study guide here. So yeah, definition of an etude, definition of an impromptu. An impromptu is any piece that is supposed to sound improvised even when it's not. So it's fake improvisation. It's meant to sound improvised. So yeah, we talked about Chopin, we talked about Wagner. We could talk about Delacroix. Delacroix is from the sort of Romantic movement in art, and he is one of those Romantics who are more associated with heroes than anything else. He is but his heroes are sort of the heroes of the French Revolution. So let's see here. Yeah, his most famous one is Liberty Leading the People, which was very influential in America and influential on a lot of later art, showing these people having a revolution, young and old, everybody gathered together to kill the enemy who are standing in their way. And so that became a very famous image, Liberty Leading the People. Delacroix was also someone who painted a lot of sort of what he would have considered exotic culture. So he painted images from Algeria and other parts of what we would now call the Middle East. And part of what he did is he exoticized, right? He generally depicted these cultures as decadent. So he focused on the women being flirty and seductive, and the men being strong and tough and guarding their women, and sort of creating the stereotypes of the Middle East that we know today. So that's Delacroix. So on the one hand, very influential in ways that we consider positive. On the other hand, very influential in these other more negative ways as well. Okay, what else can we talk about? I'm jumping around here, but hopefully this will give you guys a start, and then you can fill in some more on your own. Okay, so we've talked about Enlightenment, which is also kind of known as the Baroque. We've talked about the Romantics, and let's talk now about the Realists. So what is the realism movement in art? So the realism movement was kind of a backlash to the Romantics. You remember the Romantics were a backlash to the Enlightenment or Baroque art. The realists are a backlash to the Romantics. The Romantics, they sometimes depict real things, sometimes they depict the problems of the world that are going on, but they tend to romanticize it. They tend to make it more beautiful and pretty, whereas the realists are more about showing the shock and awe, the horrors of the world, and they are sort of countering that. And we should remember that realism is very strongly connected to the time period of the Industrial Revolution, which is when, in a long-term sense, things are getting better. We're getting things like electricity and eventually, and steam power and mass communication and whatnot. But in the short term, things are getting worse. Cities are getting smoggier. People are working in very dangerous factories now. There's a lot of bad stuff going on. So realism really goes hand in hand with the idea of recognizing these problems, showing these problems, and improving society. And not in the sort of overly philosophical way that the Enlightenment people were doing, but simply by let's recognize these problems and let's fix them. So this is the kind of thinking that leads to things like labor laws and whatnot. Let's deal with these problems and address them. So realism art is a little more shocking than Romantic art. It's less romanticized. It's trying to show you, you know, how scary things could actually be. But that isn't to say there isn't beauty in there, just that it's more focused on realism. There's also a focus on sort of ordinary day-to-day life when it comes to realism. So we talked about a lot of this stuff in terms of the Industrial Revolution, which is causes these good things, but also causes all these problems, and is quite, you know, hazardous to the health of factory workers, for instance. And this is the same time in which colonialism is continuing to expand around the world. So you actually have some philosophers who you could almost consider in a way realist philosophers, although I don't know that they would call themselves by that name, but they are connected to this idea of looking at the problems. You got people like Karl Marx, who is still very famous today for seeing some problems and proposing some solutions, but also John Stuart Mill along the same lines. There's a lot of discussion of feminism, although I don't think that word is in use yet, just the rights of women, we should say. And there are things like women's education movements that are happening during this time. But in terms of art and literature, everybody wants to, and this is especially in the second half of the 1800s. So 1850 onward is when we see the most realist movements. There's a lot of authors who are just trying to tell it like it is. You've got folks like Mark Twain, who has like Huckleberry Finn, which shows, you know, the realism of slavery. Before that, he was sort of showing ordinary people's lives in Tom Sawyer. He wrote from his own experience and he talked about that. And then Huckleberry Finn has a point to make about slavery and how evil it is. And so, you know, this is an example of seeing a problem and calling attention to it. But a lot of other authors are really interested in talking about ordinary people along the same lines. Russian authors are among them. Tolstoy is kind of famous for examining the lives of just ordinary people in extra detail. This is a time period where fiction writing goes from sort of vague and generic in some ways to being really concrete and specific. Now, we had some of that earlier on, but in terms of talking about detail and like, what is it like to actually have these experiences, our modern fiction scene is really influenced by these kinds of ideas. So all of these authors really represent this idea of looking at ordinary people in one way or another. And a lot of them also kind of advocate for addressing problems that exist. Like Kate Chopin argued for the rights of women in The Awakening. She shows this woman who basically realizes that her life is miserable with her husband, which is, you know, something that is easier to realize today, but very hard to realize in a time period that's set against you. But in the visual arts, we also see a lot of that interest in realism as well. We have the invention of photography is kind of coming along during this time period, and that's influencing things. But in their paintings, people are moving away from romanticizing things into something much more realistic. For instance, in the time period of Courbet, in the art of Courbet, we see, for instance, this funeral scene where everybody's just sort of milling about and looking at each other in weird ways, like people actually do at a funeral, not trying to make some grand dramatic statement about, oh, the passions, the emotions. No, here it's just kind of showing what's going on. We have the work of Millet, who just did a lot of art of ordinary people doing ordinary things and kind of tried to promote these ideals. Now, that said, it is still sort of evoking an image. It's trying to say, this is who we are. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, We also had some work like the cartoons of Daumier, who really argued for, who argued for the freedom of the press and for ordinary people. And then getting back to painters, we have people like Monet, who can scandalize people by painting a naked woman. There had been naked women before this, but here he shows some subtle clues to indicate that the woman is a courtesan or a prostitute, particularly the kind of neck ornament she's wearing. So, this is something that many people would have seen, but it wasn't considered proper to put it in art until now. These realists, they are breaking all the rules. So that's kind of the attitude, is break the rules, show ordinary things. And in terms of other stuff going on in this time period, we've got a lot of architecture. We talked about some of this. The development of steel girders and cast iron girders really allowed a lot of very big buildings to be built, and people were building like they'd never been building before. So that's another aspect of this movement is, while everything else is sort of more pessimistic, in terms of architecture, they're very optimistic because they're testing out new things that they've never done before. And then finally, when you get to music and stuff, you have a lot of examples of realist art, particularly in terms of their stories. Theater has the story of A Doll's House, which is about these ordinary people and the end of their marriage. You have Puccini talking about these sort of people and how these artists and how they died, and Madame Butterfly about this girl who had basically been abandoned by an American soldier, and just sort of talking about the ordinary life there. So rejecting the theme, the Enlightenment figures would paint gods, the Romantic figures would paint landscapes and heroes, but the realists would paint whatever they thought would be useful or meaningful to show to other people. They were trying to convey, what do we see out there in the world? And so they were trying to open people's eyes rather than have them be caught up in a dream. I guess you could say the Enlightenment people were trying to improve society, but through a top-down way. The Romantics were trying to celebrate the best of society and also celebrate nature. And then the realists are trying to improve society, but in a more honest way by calling attention to it. So this is kind of a process over time. New ideas come forth and they challenge the old ideas. All right, I think that's all we want to talk about for now. What I'm going to leave you with is the study guide. So again, you can find this in the content page. I believe it should be under this week, week 5. If not, it's probably in one of the other ones, but I'm pretty sure it's week 5. And what I want you guys to do for the discussion questions is, for the discussion question, find 4 of these data points and give your answer to them. So list them as your post in the discussion question. And then especially if you could find something that someone else hasn't come up with before. Also, if you want to, in terms of replies, replies are optional for this one, but if you see something someone else has said as an answer to one of these and you want to add on to it. For example, if you want to list another example of a work or an artist that celebrates nature for the Romantic period, or you want to talk about a little bit more about how realism was connected to the idea of improving society, share a few more thoughts there, feel free. So that can be your reply if you want. And then for your own part, try and find 4 data points on here and give your quick little explanation. Some of them are simple, like who is the author of something. Some of them are more complicated, and these are more the type that you would see for written questions. On the exam, you'll have both multiple choice and written questions. So try to come up with examples of things, like examples of realist paintings or examples of romantic paintings. That's how you'll do well for the written questions on the exam. Okay, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about, but I'm going to keep checking my email. I'll try and be very up on my email on Thursday in case there are any technical problems. So I'll keep checking back, but you can expect me to be around in the mornings and the evenings checking email. I also try to be available on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock and Fridays at 9 a.m. to, 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. So, yep, if you want to reach out to me then, or anytime, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right, take care.